object of a constitution is to set out the structure of government. Now, our constitution recognizes that the sovereignty is in the people. So it's the people's sovereignty which is exercised by different organs of government. So you have the executive, or the president, the cabinet of ministers, and the rest of the executive. You have the legislature or the parliament, and you have the courts. So power of the people is exercised by these different organs. Now the object of a constitution is to set out how this power is exercised and to ensure that those who exercise the power actually exercise it on behalf of the people and not in their own personal interest or for other reasons. Now the 19th Amendment to the Constitution came about at a time when there had for decades, since 1994 at least, at every election been some sort of promise made to reduce the powers of the executive president or to abolish the executive presidency. Why was this? Now the president is supposed to be answerable to parliament. The constitution provides for that. However, the president had until that time the power to appoint from members of parliament the ministers, deputy ministers, and non-cabinet ministers or state ministers. So by appointing these ministers, the president was able to control the parliament, which was in fact supposed to be a check on the president or supposed to supervise the president. So in fact, because the president wielded these powers, parliament didn't function as an effective check on the president. So there was a demand to reduce the powers of the president, and this was one of those problematic areas. Now the 19th Amendment to the Constitution brought a system where those appointments of ministers, deputy ministers, state ministers would be made by the president but on the advice of the prime minister, and the prime minister has to day in and day out be responsible to parliament, because if he acts in a way which violates the confidence of parliament, parliament can remove him by passing a no confidence motion against the government. Another area was that the 19th Amendment strengthened the judiciary and the independent commissions. Prior to the 19th Amendment, appointments to those bodies were made by the president. Now, when one political actor makes those appointments, there is a risk of politicization. What the 19th Amendment did was to make the concurrence of the Constitutional Council or the recommendation of the Constitutional Council a condition precedent to the president making those appointments. So there was a depoliticization of the institutions. The structure was depoliticized. The third main feature, I would say, out of the many features of the 19th Amendment was providing the right to information. So if you have a problem with school admissions and you think that someone has been unduly favored, that you have been discriminated, you can seek that information. Or you participate at a tender and someone else who has quoted a higher amount is given a tender to supply certain goods, or there is corruption, you can seek by an RTI application to get the necessary documents and to ensure that your rights are protected. So that the right to information is a tool to protect the other rights of the public and also a tool for fighting corruption. Now the 19th Amendment was passed in April 2015. That's soon after the presidential election but before the general election. At that time, the UNP had less than 50 members in parliament. The majority of parliament was the UPFA. So while this was presented by a UNP government, it was only enacted because of the support of the UPFA and in fact all the other parties in parliament. From all the members of the UPFA, only one member of parliament voted against the 19th Amendment. So this was a piece of legislation brought by a united effort of the entire parliament. Now, as I explained, the 19th Amendment ensured checks and balances. It ensured that organs of government were accountable in respect of the power which each of those organs exercised. Now, if the Honorable Prime Minister today says that we must abolish the 19th Amendment, give us 2/3 majority to abolish the 19th Amendment, my interpretation of that statement is that he says that if we are in opposition, we like to have a constitution which ensures that the government is accountable, that there are checks and balances, and that you exercise power in trust for the people. But if we are going to exercise power, then what he's saying is we want to abolish this because we want to exercise power in a system which has less checks and balances, which has less provisions to ensure that power is exercised in an accountable way. So I think the request that his party be given a 2/3 majority to abolish the 19th Amendment to the Constitution tells us a lot about what he feels or of his view of democracy and having democratic structures in place. Now, the 19th Amendment provided certain transitional provisions. That is, when the 19th Amendment was enacted, President Maithripala Sirisena had already been elected as president. So the 19th Amendment had a provision which said there would be some powers which he would continue to exercise during the term of his office. Namely, that he could continue to be the Minister of Defence, the Minister in charge of Environment, and the Minister in charge of Mahaweli. Now, with the end of his term and after the 16th of November 2019, that transitional provision is no longer in force. So, any president in office after 16th of November 2019 can only appoint ministers, deputy ministers, and non-cabinet ministers or state ministers on the advice of the Prime Minister. So it is a more parliamentary form of government. Also, unlike the President Maithripala Sirisena, the current president or anyone after him under the 19th Amendment cannot allocate ministries or subjects and functions to himself. Now, as I explained earlier, by the demand for a 2/3 majority to abolish the 19th Amendment, you can make an evaluation of the respect that this government has towards democracy or the lack of appreciation of a need to have democratic structures in place. In addition, the government has now been in office for about 7 or 8 months. There are several incidents which show us that they don't really have much respect for democratic structures or systems or for fundamental human rights. For example, shortly after they were elected to office, there was interference in the police. So CID officers who had investigated powerful people in the government or close to powerful people in the government were transferred. Recently, there were reports in the media that a particular individual who is named as a suspect in the investigation relating to the assassination of Lasantha Wickramatunge has been appointed as the director of the CID. Then there were numerous instances where social media activists and media activists were arrested for statements which did not amount to hate speech. But at the same time, you found a lot of hate speech, including on certain electronic media, and no action was taken in respect of those. Then you had the incident where there were social activists and civil society activists and political activists protesting the murder of George Floyd. They were engaged in a peaceful protest, but they were violently disrupted by the police and by the use of force and arrested. Then you had the problems due to the coronavirus. They said you need curfews, social distancing, and certain so-called rules were brought into force. But when a powerful minister close to the present government passed away, those rules were not applied to his funeral. All of these tell us about the respect or lack thereof that the government has for basic fundamental rights. Then you had the incident of Karuna Amman, who admitted his role in the killing of thousands of Sri Lanka army personnel, but no arrest was made with regard to him under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. He was not placed under detention orders, though that act is used for allegations of a far less serious nature. Then we had special presidential task force in the recent past, including one to create a so-called disciplined society. Now, one might question why you need a military-led task force to create disciplined societies. The discipline is more a personal matter rather than a matter for the state. But if by discipline one means law and order, then in terms of the law, you have the Sri Lanka police to ensure that law and order is maintained. If necessary, you have special units of the police like the Special Task Force, the CID, or if that is not enough, you can set up special units inside the police in terms of the existing law to carry out those functions. Now, creating a task force like this, led by the military, predominantly comprised of military personnel, outside the framework of the existing law, is itself extremely problematic and is a feature that you would see more in militarized states or in dictatorships or systems which reject the notion of democracy. Now, a connected point that one should look at when you look at all these lapses is the relationship between the economy and democracy. Now, to me, democracy is something which must be protected because it is something important in its own right. But since there is a lot of discussion about whether democratic ideals should be foremost in our minds at present and aren't there economic concerns, what is the economic implication? Now, you will find that when foreign investors look at countries to invest in, one of the things that they will consider is how the society functions, how structures functions, whether they are within a democratic framework. Why? Because if a state tries to expropriate their property or they have other disputes with other state or non-state actors in that society, they need to have an effective remedy. And you have an effective remedy in a democratic system. So if democratic ideals are not being followed, in that type of system you will find that foreign investors are wary of investing in that type of a country. So not adhering to democratic norms is harmful to the citizens. There is a risk that that type of a government will violate your rights one day, but there is also a risk that it will disincentivize foreign investors from investing in the country. Now you had in November, early December, certain so-called tax concessions being given to the people, probably because they knew that an election is at the doorstep, and those were given on a very short-sighted basis. If those concessions were carried out, the national revenue would significantly drop. The gap between state expenditure and state income would increase. When that gap widens, the risk of us defaulting on foreign loans is higher. Because that risk is higher, rating agencies like Fitch reduced our credit ratings. So it is a signal to those who might want to grant loans, etc., or invest in our bonds, etc., that this is a more risky investment. So you disincentivize that type of foreign loans as well. Even where loans are given, it might then be at a higher interest rate. Couple all of that, the short-sighted economic policy with a lack of respect for democracy, and you have very serious economic implications. And that is why I say, in addition to protecting democracy in its own right, you must protect democracy because it also has implications for the economy.